Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Finance Committee for Thursday, July 20th, 2023. It's 2:36, and I'd like to call this meeting to order and acknowledge that the Sunshine Coast Regional District is located in the territory of the Sechelt and Squamish Nations. We're a little bit late getting started today due to the previous meeting, so I will ask for directors if there's anything to add to the agenda, and if not, a motion to adopt the agenda as presented, please. Moved and seconded. All those in favor? That's carried. Thank you. Next up, can I have a motion to receive all of the reports? Moved and seconded. All those in favor? Carried. Thank you. So with that, we will go straight into Annex A, which is the Sunshine Coast Regional District Q2 Corporate Financial Variance, starting on page 2. And Manager Wing, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the second quarter corporate variance report. We present these reports at the end of the second and third quarter every year in July and October. This is a high-level corporate variance report. It's intended to identify areas of concern within services that are projecting deficits. I always like to point out there are, this report, just due to the timing, there's a number of accrual estimates that go into it. So if there are any adjustments that come out after the fact, those will be reflected in the Q3 or year-end numbers. Just quickly, some highlights from the report. User fee revenue, we always like to have a look at variable user fee revenue. In certain services, these would be like building inspection, community recreation. Those are all tracking on or above budget. Thus far, with the exception of community parks. That's due to just a budget oversight with the change in Catherine Lake agreement. So we'll be addressing that going into next year's budget. It's a minor variance overall. Expenses are tracking similar to 2022. We're seeing about 92% of budget to date for base operating budgets. That compares to 91% last year. One area that we're seeing higher over budget is short-term interest expenses, and that's obviously reflective of the current interest rate environment that we're seeing. Overall, we're projecting or reporting deficits at the end of the second quarter in 8 services. Those are listed on pages 4 and 5 of the agenda. And there's a few there that are concerning, and we'll be looking at further and reviewing with the budget managers to look at mitigating factors through to year end. With that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much, Manager Wing. First up is Director McMahon.
So I have 2 questions on page 5. The first is about Gibson's and District Fire Protection. That's quite a bit of budget overage. Do we have a little more information on that?
We had a cursory look at it, and we couldn't pinpoint anything specific. Just general spending seemed to be just general spending overall. So you know, obviously within the fire service, there's a lot of equipment and stuff that needs to be purchased. So it's along those lines in terms of what they've been purchasing, and we'll have a close look at it with the budget manager going forward. Yeah.
We also, do we pay any stipends to our firefighters? So the number of call-outs would not be reflected in a budget overall overage?
We do pay honorariums to the volunteers. Those would not be reflected in the base budget numbers. They're excluded, so that's over and above what's there. Yeah.
Thank you. Director Stamford.
I'm not sure what the concept or the definition of internal recoveries means, and if you could just explain it to me in English.
An internal recovery is when 2 services are doing business with each other, for lack of a better term. So when Parks takes their garbage to the landfill, they are charged for that. Yeah.
Thank you. Director McMahon.
Yes, and community parks, user fee revenue is under budget. I was wondering where we get fee revenue from in community parks? Would that include community halls, or where are the fees coming from?
Yes, the only fee revenue we receive now is through community hall rentals. Previously, there was Catherine Lake Campground rentals, and that's now being, there's a different arrangement with the contractor there, so.
All right, thank you. Directors, any other questions? Last chance. If you've got them, please quote a page number as well, because it's a pretty long report. Director Bax?
Is this, we're talking about the other amendments, or sorry, the attachments as well, right?
Yep.
Okay, so in attachment A on page 7, in the first line of revenues, under variance total revenues, there's brackets around this number, and to me, that tells me that's a deficit when it shows that the actuals year-to-date are actually that much less than the budgeted year-to-date. So I was wondering if this a typo, or is this some type of, I don't know why it's showing in brackets, because to me that tells me that that's a deficit, but it doesn't seem to be a deficit, it seems to be extra money.
Yeah, it's really a presentation thing with the report. So, you know, these are formulas. The variance is calculated through a formula. On the revenue side, in accounting speak, those are actually credits. So they are actually negative values when they go into the system. That's what a revenue is. So when you see so
To me, there's just no,
Is that a follow-up, Director Bax?
it's a follow-up.
Yeah.
It does change later on in the report. It seems to be that the bracketed numbers are deficits, and then, but this is not a deficit. This is,
Thank you.
don't understand stuff.
It's just the way the templates, I think, are set up, but
we'll have a look at it. This has come up before, and, you know, we'll review it and see if we can simplify it.
Thank
in
you.
any way. Yes.
Director Gabias?
Thank you, Chair. This is my first budget variance report. Fascinating stuff. I'm wondering if I could get a bit of help in understanding. I'm just going to pick one at random, page 72, where there's like big numbers in amortization of tangible capital assets. I'm just wondering, like, what kind of hocus pocus? How does, like, I'm just trying to understand how this all works, and how there's like these big numbers and no deficit, and if you could just give me like a little 101, that'd be amazing.
Certainly. Within the budget, we have a number of non-cash items, such as amortization. It's an expense that we record, but obviously the cash outlay occurs when the asset's actually purchased. So this is amortization of tangible capital assets. So in the section below, under the other, you'll see an offsetting entry that's called unfunded amortization, which directly offsets that non-cash. And so we can present a bottom line surplus deficit that is based on the actual sources and uses of funds, if we go to the legislation and what we're actually required to report and budget on. So yeah, so when we report a surplus deficit in terms of the budget, it is just that. It's reflective of the actual sources and uses of funds, cash in, cash out. The reporting that we do for our financial statements is different. That's looking at true revenue and expenses, including all those non-cash items or other items which may not be considered revenue or expenses under accounting standards.
Thank you for that. I'm just going to ask a follow-up specifically about the amortization of tangible capital assets, because hypothetically, as a non-cash transaction, what causes the variance? Because we've got the budgeted amount and then the actual amount, but theoretically we know what our asset is. So just clarity. Thank you.
I would say that the variance in this particular line is because the amortization budget was likely not updated to reflect actuals. So yeah.
Okay, timing differences. Director Lee.
Thank you, Chair. I actually have two questions. I actually didn't have this question till just now, but just to make sure I understand this using the same example that Director Gabius just did. But I'm curious one, and that is to and from reserves. So the way I look at this is that we expected to draw $8,630 from reserves, but in fact, it looks like we're putting $13,165 more into reserves. What would you say is causing that?
So that would be caused by a timing difference with project funding. What you're seeing would be a budgeted contribution to the reserve, and then there's a project in there that's funded from reserves where we haven't incurred the expenditures yet, required to offset that.
Right, so that also would explain the capital expenditures, including wages. That has got a variance because the projects aren't there yet. Good, thank you. And my other question, if I may, Chair, is on page 7. There's something, a funny acronym I didn't understand. TCA. What the heck's a TCA?
So that's within the other category, the fourth
The
line.
other proceeds from sale of TCA.
Yeah, so TCA stands for Tangible Capital Asset.
Oh, okay, thank you. We're selling something. Okay.
All right, thank you, Director Lee. I don't see any other hands up. Director Bax, just in the nick of time.
I just have a question about how we move the money around within a service. I'm looking at page 37 because it's the Roberts Creek Fire Protection Service. And we've transferred $87,000, almost $88,000 to reserve, and yet there's a $15,766 deficit. Is that normal practices to transfer to reserve and leave ourselves in a deficit position?
It is, yes, because through the budget adoption, the financial plan adoption, the board has committed to those contributions to what would be capital reserves in this case. So you're funding, this is your capital plan funding that's being contributed there. If it comes to a deficit at year end, we look at mitigating options there, which may or may not include a possibility of transferring funding from operational reserves to cover off the deficit.
Which is an important distinction as well, because we can't use capital reserves to fund operating deficits.
Gotcha.
So,
That makes sense.
yeah. Director Gabius.
Thank you, Chair. Just a general question. When there is a deficit, like how is it remediated and how? I'm not sure what I'm trying to ask here. What should we be looking to do?
Where does the money come from?
Where does the money come from? Yeah, that's a good start.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So that would be addressed through the year end, through the budgeting process in 2024. The Local Government Act requires that the deficit be included in the following year's financial plan and that it be funded in that financial plan. So as part of the year end process, we'd present options for funding that.
But just to add to that, between now and then, working with staff, they may be able to mitigate some of those deficits through operational changes. Director Bax.
Okay, moving along. Page 44, we're talking public transit here. The second line of revenue says government transfers, and it shows a deficit under the budgetary year to date. Which government is that? Is it the provincial government we're talking about? And will they be submitting the other $250,000 that has been budgeted and later this year? Is that what we can expect?
Provincial government, first of all, because it's transit.
Provincial government, yeah, that's what I figured.
And then
Yes, that's right. So this is funding's coming from BC Transit, which is a provincial body, and this funding is coming through the AOA. It's not the annual operating agreement with BC Transit. So it's not a grant. It's part of the operational funding for the service. It's classified as a government transfer because of where it's coming from. We would expect that this would mitigate through year end. Obviously, there's seasonality within the service. So we see recoveries pick up in the summer as service levels expand. BC Transit, or the transit service, I will say, is one where there are certainly accrual estimates, just due to the timing of invoicing that comes in from transit. So, I'll put that caveat out there that this one is one that has a number of estimates in it for the variance report. So,
Thank you. Yes. Short answer, yes. Director Lee.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to say thanks very much for the explanation in front of those sheets in the financial plan with all the little red arrows and the write-ups. I'd forgot about some of it, and I went and refreshed my excellent addition. Thank you.
Thank you. And Director Bax.
Yeah, page 48 through, good God, 58, 48 through 10 pages. 10 pages of street lighting services. Is there any way that and all these 10 pages, they come up with a surplus of $439. Is there any way to combine these services to make it easier for staff to just deal with this and probably save us money in the long run? I don't know. I don't see the point in having 10 different street lighting services.
Welcome to the regional district
I know,
silos.
I know, but I just want to know what's just combine them into one street lighting service. Can that not be done? There is a regional street lighting service, and I don't know, I just don't understand. Okay.
Go ahead.
yeah, so you mentioned the regional street lighting service. That service will be your street lights that are along the highway or in high traffic areas. The smaller ones are local area services, so they're servicing a specific subdivision. In one case, it's actually servicing one individual parcel of land. So they're all local services that are established by their own establishing bylaws.
Follow up. So the funding for each local service comes from the local users, is
Yes.
that correct?
Yes,
But so people that will drive by aren't supposed to get any light? Is that
that's right. Thank you. Thank you, Director Bax. Are there any other questions before we move on with our agenda? Director McMahon.
I can't resist following up on that. I did ask before if the residents now, because these were established 30 or 40 years ago in many cases, if they said, oh, we don't want streetlights anymore. Like, we never review these services, do we? We just, once they're established, they go on forever? Or is there any mechanism whatsoever to review them? Thank you.
I think that the question's outside the purview of the quarterly variance report, but I will look over to the corporate officer who's turned her microphone on.
So a service, there are a couple types of service reviews. There's informal service reviews that the board may undertake, and then there's actually a statutory legislative process for a service review if there's, say, a participant who wants to withdraw, for example, from a service. And by participant, I mean an electoral area or a municipality. Typically, the way to dissolve a service is the same manner by which it was established. So we would have to do that process in reverse. And it really depends what the service is. Every service will have some nuance or variation likely to that process, and it will likely involve elector approval at some point.
All right, thank you. Director Stanford.
Okay, following that, slightly off the topic, is dog control for the islands. Would that be an unofficial or official review if Gambier Island wanted to get back into dog control? I see it's not well used on Keats right now.
Do you have a page number?
It would be on page 43. Doesn't have to be totally answered today. It's just something I'm thinking about.
I think it's outside, well, corporate officer.
All I'll say is there is history with respect to that question, and we can take it offline and talk about it further if you wish to know some more history on dog control on the islands. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. Director Bax.
Not in a hurry, are you? Page 61, I'm looking at the landfill closure and post-closure expenditures line. We budgeted $1.25 million for this year, and there's nothing in it. I was wondering why that is.
Haven't spent it yet.
Is it because we haven't spent it, or is that the answer?
It's the stage H plus closure, I think.
Okay, just wanted to know if there's,
Yep.
the money is there and we haven't used it. Very
Mhm.
good.
All right. Is that everything, or Director Bax, did you have another one?
I'm scrolling. Nothing yet.
Perhaps you can take any additional questions offline,
Oh,
and we can move on with our agenda.
I have a question, page 85,
Last one?
maybe. Is there a formula for transfer to reserves to the ratio of the surplus? Is there a formula that we use, or is it just for per service? If we have a certain amount of reserves and we're transferring it, are we set? Do we have a set amount that we transfer to reserves, or is it a ratio, a percentage of the surplus that we transfer to reserves?
And you were looking at page 85?
Page 85.
I think I know the answer to this one, but I'll turn to, I think this is to pay for the mapping services that we undertake every 4 or 5 years, aerial photography. But I'll look over to staff.
Thank you, Chair. I'll do my best to answer. I think, if I'm understanding the question correctly, what we do at year end is we present a surplus deficit report as part of the budget. It usually goes to round 1 or round 2 budget. And we'll recommend contributing those surpluses to reserves at that time and seek a board resolution to that effect. This is also in the board's financial sustainability policy, that surpluses will be transferred to reserves to fund future projects or one-time initiatives, those sorts of things. So it's ultimately up to the board what they choose to do with the surplus. But per policy, we follow the transfer to reserves.
Thank you. And yeah, when you see a very particular number in that line, it's contributing towards a project, whether it's in the current year or not. So looking at the one here on page 85, I assume you're talking about that $7,500?
Yes.
Yeah, so that is specifically for a project that will occur on an interval. So a little bit of money is transferred into reserves every year, so that when that project needs to be done, we don't have to tax for the full amount. Another one?
Sometimes I just ask these questions for clarity for the public and for myself. Page 87, the Heritage Conservation Service. Is this a dead service? Is this something, it's just full of a bunch of zeros? I was just wondering exactly what that is.
I can say that is not, definitely an established service that we have, but we don't have a budget for it. So we don't anticipate any activity within it.
Okay, I just find it a little strange.
Well, if the service no longer has, or doesn't have a purpose, defunding it could be easier than dissolving it.
Ah, yes,
But it does have a purpose.
I'm familiar with such practices.
Director Lee?
I do believe that particular service does have a purpose. If, for instance, if we wanted to put, and I'm sure I'll be corrected here, but I understand, like, if we wanted to do something like designate the Sarah Ray Hall as a heritage building, we'd put money in there and then do the work out of that function.
Okay,
So we just don't have any planned for this year.
perfect. Thank you. Director Bax?
No, I'm fine for now.
Okay, thank you, Director Bax. Okay, I don't see any other hands up, so thank you very much for that and for answering our questions. We're going to move on to Annex B, which is the 2023 budget debrief and 2024 to 2028 financial planning process. And we will turn this over to CFO Perot.
Thank you, Chair. So this particular report is a conclusion of the 2023 budget process, and it's to solicit feedback and propose changes to the 2024 financial planning process that's about to begin. It gives a summary. The board did have a informal workshop to discuss the process, and that was an opportunity also for newly elected directors to give a better understanding of process. Included in here too, we do have a financial planning timeline for approval for this year, which does have some slight changes to past process, and this is part of what was identified as a request back from the committee members, was to try to find ways to streamline our process. And therefore, for 2024, we're proposing to not have a pre-budget process as we've had in the past. What we would do is we'd go right into the round one budget deliberations in December and have just round one and round two. And some of the rationale for that is that we have just looked at past practice associated with what happens during pre-budget, and we felt that we can accomplish those same objectives within having round one budget in the December timeframe. It does also mean that the community partners and stakeholders would not have a subsequent change necessarily, because they still require presenting their budgets. But we have also suggested that this year, those community partners that really don't have a change to their requests or service levels, that they just be included in the budget. And that would streamline and reduce perhaps some overhead for them as well. And if they did want to present their programming or an update to the committee as far as an annual report, et cetera, they could come to subsequent committees to be a delegation to present to us. And so that would further streamline the process. Any carry forwards would also be included in that particular committee, as well as capital plans. So that would be something that we would see a little bit more of time associated with round one. But we see that within an afternoon or a morning block that could be completed. We still believe that within the 3-day scheduled timelines that we've done in the past, that we could carry on the business. And why the rationale for some of that is we're also trying to look forward to bringing the water utilities capital plans, at least a first draft or iteration. And what that would mean is that you'd see a significant reduction in some of the budget proposals that you see, because most functions that you have multiple budget proposals for is because they don't have those capital plans. So you're having each project coming forward for consideration. So that would significantly streamline. Now, there is obviously some caveats to that, and one would be staff's capacity within that service to be able to deliver on that. And so we would probably hold a special committee or present it as part of a committee of the whole ahead of the budget process, just so there was a precursor, because it's a pretty significant and important service, and we wouldn't just be doing it for regional water, we'd be doing it for north and south as well. So that is one of our most significant undertakings with asset management, but it has been taking longer just due to the obvious, which is the droughts and severe water restrictions, and having staff being seconded to those initiatives and not having the capacity to work on operational type of projects. So those are some of the considerations for this year. We also have some minor housekeeping amendments to potentially streamline, and obviously the most important policy document starting this weekend is the board's strategic plan. So I think part of the considerations for pushing things to December and not trying to rush for pre-budget for November is to allow for the new strategic plan and us to be able to present options for implementation as part of the 2024 budget. So otherwise, we'll take any questions if there are any, and we do have other staff on board to take them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, CFO Perot. Director McMahon.
Thank you. I'm supportive of, ditching the pre-budget session. If staff thinks it'll work, that sounds very good to me. It'll move us forward, I think, a little more swiftly. The community partners, I'm wondering if we should consider a criteria for whether they need to present or not. Like for other things, there is a monetary limit before it comes to the board. And I'm just wondering if we set like $50,000 or $100,000 budget as the criteria that we would definitely meet with those community partners. It's still, I think if we set the limit at $50,000, it's still just the libraries and the museum. I'm pretty sure. But did staff consider that as a possible way of weeding that out? Thanks.
We didn't necessarily look at monetary because that's not always the driver. I think sometimes there's other considerations, so we didn't necessarily want to just be financial in our considerations. So I believe that this will be something that we also don't want, that we still want an avenue for community groups to be able to present publicly into the board because that allows for transparency. So I think one of the things we thought was that we allow for their material to be included on the agenda. It'll still mean it'll be a big agenda, but there's not necessarily a decision. It's just for information, and that it's just, I think, understood. We'd have maybe a summary page as we do and just say these have been included in the budget and there's nothing subsequent to that. But we definitely communicate ahead of time. And I think this is where part of the recommendation is that we believe we should host a meeting with the community, not just send correspondence, that we actually have a purposeful event with them to explain the process and some of the rationale. And try to even solicit some feedback from them. We've done that. It's not been since 2017 that we have undergone something like that. So that's, I think, what my thought was, just from a staff side of the house. I think when you get into those larger services, that such as the libraries, but then again, you have reading rooms that are on the smaller scale. So I think this will be something that we'll have to navigate and not be too prescriptive on, because if there are things the board wants to consider as far as escalating service levels and considerations to that, I think there still needs to be an avenue for that. And it might just mean a reading room wanting to, or a service, I'm not going to pick on a specific one, who wants to expand service quite drastically, and I think that if it was a regional district service, would be a board decision, and we feel that again, we've never prescribed a monetary amount. It's more from a service level and ongoing financial implication that you'd want to understand what the full cost implication is for that. So I guess that's a long-winded answer in saying, I guess a ceiling or a cap might not just fit the bill in all cases, and I think this is where having that dialogue with some of the community partners to get feedback from them as well is important.
Thank you. Follow up?
Yeah, I probably expressed myself poorly in that I meant that if it was a certain level, then it would be a mandatory annual meeting, whereas all of the other criteria you mentioned are totally, I totally understand that. Are we going to look at this again, like the community partner process? I think the libraries really need a lot more contact with the regional district about their process and their budgets, because they are very substantial budgets. Would that be staff to staff? Would it be elected to elected? Are we going to revisit the process around community partners? Thanks.
Just before I go to CFO Pro, are you talking about before the 2024 budget cycle, or incorporating feedback that we determine something did or didn't work when we do the 2024 debrief? Just to clarify.
I'm not sure.
So perhaps what is the process going to look like leading into the 2024 budget cycle for the libraries, for example? want to clarify?
Yeah, sorry, it's getting towards the end of the day and I'm fogging up here, but there used to be a pre-meeting with the libraries before the budget process, during which the libraries discussed how things were going, and it involved the library boards came and the library directors, and it was staff and the relevant directors. And particularly with the Gibson's Library, because we are their landlord as well as their funder, it was an opportunity to have a general discussion about the direction of the libraries. And I thought it was a reasonably valuable process, and it helped get everybody clear about expectations going into the budget process. So I just throw that out there as a suggestion that that might be one way to go. But I would like to clarify how we're going to work, particularly with the libraries going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So I most certainly heard that as part of last year's process. So we still even have some undergoing direction from the board related to, say, for instance, the Seashell Library and what the ongoing agreement is going to be. So there'll be more to come on that side. But what I envisioned was to have this meeting and solicit that feedback from them as well, because I believe the board has expressed that back to staff, maybe not in a directive, but most certainly it's on my list of how we're going to navigate that. I think there was some reasons why we discontinued some of those to ensure that some of the information shared in there or any decision making, et cetera, was in a public venue. But all to say, let's take this offline, and if there is a subsequent reporting back that the committee wants, then maybe that would be the direction back to staff, that staff be directed to report back on how community stakeholders, community partners will be presenting during budget. We could bring that at a subsequent meeting, say in October or November.
Okay, yeah, we'll put a pin in that for the time being. Director Gabius.
Thank you, Chair. Where does the discussion about utility rates setting fit into this timeline?
Great question.
So we didn't necessarily include it in here because it's part of a financial planning consideration. I know that was some of the concerns when we were setting rates ahead of the financial planning. What we do see in this particular timeline is that you're a little more aligned with that decision. So I think we were, the meetings regarding utilities are still going to likely happen or be presented in November. And then round one will likely happen, and then the bylaw will be adopted after round one is kind of how we've mapped it out right now. I didn't put in a staff report because this is not solidified yet. So I didn't quite want to codify it. So that's, I think, what we're bantering about internally is how do we sequence those to try to align financial related decisions to the ratepayer, because it's a little awkward because the way our bylaws are written right now, they're fiscal, so we have to do it before the end of the year. So as we start moving our financial planning process earlier and earlier, we'll be a little more aligned with utility rate structure setting.
Thank you. Director Lee.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to make a motion to accept the recommendations on page 108, please.
Thank you, Director Lee, and I've got that seconded from Director White. I don't see any other hands up. I will call the question. This is voting all those in favor. And that's carried. Thank you very much. Moving on to Annex C, Sunshine Coast Regional District debt. As of June 30th, 2023, Annex C in our agenda package. I don't know. Oh, I see Manager Smith is online. And you're muted, Manager Smith.
Thank you, Chair. Just introducing the report for information, and if you have any questions, I'm available.
Great, thank you very much. Directors, we've already received the report. Are there any questions? Director McMahon?
Yes, and it's very likely somebody told me this a while ago, but on page 121, I note that the Church Road borrowing is on a term of 30 years. That's quite long compared to a lot of our other borrowing, and I was just curious as to why we went to 30 years on that one. Thanks.
Thank you. CFO Perot?
Thank you, Chair. So that would have been presented for consideration when the AAP was first presented or when the project was first presented. And recollection was that we aligned the debt to the life cycle of the asset. And at that time, it was understood that this type of infrastructure is long-lasting and doesn't require a lot of replacement within the 30-year time frame. So it was selected at that particular time.
Follow-up?
So if we were to build recreation facilities again, would we potentially look at a longer timeline? Or then again, we have a expensive roof replacement. So are we looking at this as a policy in terms of long-term borrowing, is to consider the lifespan of the asset when we're determining the borrowing period?
I believe it's already in the policy. Yeah.
It's in a number of policies. It would be in your financial sustainability policy. It would be in your debt management policy, and I think in your maybe some allusion to, or alluding to it within your financial planning policy. So we match debt funding or any sources of funding in accordance with the life cycle of the asset, and especially in your asset management planning.
Go ahead.
So I can't resist. But when we were in a really low interest environment, a 30-year amortization or period made a lot more sense. But now that we're going into a higher interest cycle, maybe because this becomes pretty expensive if we end up paying a lot more. So I don't know, perhaps we will look at this again.
In the report on page 120, under the long-term rates there, it mentions that new issues are funded with a 10-year term and are typically refinanced every 5 years following the 10-year term. Just looking to clarify then with the Church Road wellfield specifically, does that fall under that same 10-year term and then refinancing? Go ahead.
Yes, and it's also a risk. So I think we just have to understand that, especially as you're making decisions related to your capital planning, because this is something that we've highlighted, and especially as you head into your financial or into your strategic planning, we have a lot of infrastructure requirements in the regional districts. You haven't seen the full picture for water, but you do understand what you're going to be needing as far as water supply requirements in all the services. And you know it's multi-millions of dollars. We'll always try to attract grants. But the financial sustainability of the organization, if interest rates remain within this level, will be a consideration for the board, because the affordability of it will become a little precarious. You have, if you recall the last, not to be, alarmist, but in the water rates, the regional water rates report, the operating reserves are almost fully depleted last year. And so part of the user rate increase and the parcel tax increase this year was to try to repatriate. And you have under $5 million within that service, which is really not sustainable. So, we don't have any other choice but to use debt right now. And so we're going to, hard decisions are going to be made.
Sure. Thank you. Director Inkster.
Thank you, Chair. It's an interesting discussion. The interest rates could go up and we could re-amortize at a higher rate, as Ms. Perot said. But it is interesting as well, though, that we're fearful of rates around 4 or 5% when a number of board members, those that Len may remember, 17 to 20%. So it's just the financial decisions that we have to make. I think 3 to 5% is relatively low compared to historical rates. Thanks.
Thank you, Director Inkster. Director McMahon.
I apologize, but I can't resist pointing this out. A director from Cathet, who had his baby daughter with him at a meeting, was saying, do you realize that she'll be 31 before we pay this off? And when you put it in that context, it is a little bit shocking. When you're sitting here being 60, 30 years, oh, what the heck? But we are, in fact, when we borrow for that length of time, we are committing another generation to costs. So we have to be cognizant of what we're doing going forward. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Director McMahon. All right, I don't see any other hands up, so thank you for that report. We're going to move on to Annex D, which is the Canada Community Building Fund Community Works Fund update. And this is back over to Manager Smith.
Thank you. Just a summary for information again, and if you have any questions, available to answer them.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Director McMahon.
Yeah, sorry, me again. So UBCM is negotiating the agreement for the Community Works Fund with the federal government again. So the money we already have on hand, if they come up with new criteria for projects, can we use that going forward? Because I have some projects in my area that I can think of that really need funding, and it would be awfully nice if we could spend gas tax, but under the current criteria, we can't.
CFO Perot.
Well, I don't have an answer to that because we don't have a new agreement. Those are proposals that have been submitted through the funders. So hopefully those do get incorporated into the new agreement. So we can't action that right now because we're within the existing agreement. So let's cross our fingers they're included.
I guess the question, Director McMahon, is do you have some fallback projects in case they're not? Director Bax.
Drawing your attention to page 125, summary of community works funding. It shows that in my area, Roberts Creek, the 2023 funding allocation is $154,781, and I was wondering where that went. What is that for? I know that I've taken $526,771 out to work on the bulge, and another $88,000 to put towards the Hopkins Landing repair.
Director Bax, if I can cut you off, that's the funding that your area will be receiving.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Glad I could help.
Hey, you're welcome. Oh, so you just gave me $154,000.
You're welcome. Director McMahon.
Sorry, maybe I didn't clarify clearly enough, and maybe this is not answerable, but if, say I had $1 million left over, unallocated at the end of this year, and a new agreement comes in, would we be held to the terms of the old agreement for the money that we received previous? That's what I was trying to get at.
And I don't think you can get an answer to that today because we don't know what the terms of the new agreement are going to look like or whether they're going to allow that or backdate it, right? So, yeah. Director Lee.
I was just noticing how much money everybody has, and I have so little. I was wondering what percent interest you might charge me if I was to borrow some. Anyways, no answer, okay.
Thank you, Director Lee. Director Bax.
Yeah, I have some ideas as to how to use it, but I don't know whether or not they're eligible and how I could go about finding out. Is there and can I unilaterally put this money towards a project that's approved, or do I need board approval to allocate this money?
CFO.
What staff's recommendation would be is to go through your strategic planning process. Find out what your priorities are going to be going forward in your term. and see how those land from what type of implementation and priorities would be identified in that. And again, as part of the 2024 budgeting process, that's when new initiatives are to be identified. It has been a interesting concept on how to solicit requests, because of course staff's focus is on existing priorities within existing services. So how to integrate maybe constituency or community demand or requests is something that needs to be contemplated in the same context. So how does it fit within the priority and matching it against other requirements? Obviously, all funds, our main priority is to reduce the burden on taxpayers, reduce debt. So I think that's where our first recommendation back to the committee always is. So we'd have to take a look and see how we contemplate certain ones. As far as process goes, recommendations back to staff to see if those fit, and then we ask the grantor whether they fit within the existing criteria.
Thank you. And there are a couple of reports that have been circulated previously that talk about criteria and things like that, so we can.
I've read some of them,
Yeah,
yes.
Director Bax?
You said one of our priorities is to reduce taxpayer debt. Are these funds, can we directly apply them to reduce taxpayer debt? It's not my understanding. My understanding is that we have to use them for capital costs for certain infrastructure things, is it not?
If I may take this question on.
Certainly, please do.
Look at page 127 in the report. The very first item highlighted in green is Area A emergency generator. And so in this particular case, Area A has committed to $125,000 in gas tax funding, so that Area A, or whichever Pender Water Service this is for, doesn't have to borrow to buy that generator. So that's debt that's not being taken on, but gas tax is being used to fund. So hopefully that, yeah,
Have to be innovative.
indeed. All right, I don't see any other hands up. So with that, and this has been received already for information, so we have no communications, no new business, no in-camera session, so I look for a motion to adjourn. Moved and seconded, all those in favor? Carried. Thank you very much. And we have no attendees, so we have no questions. So thank you very much.
Not bad.